Chapter 6. She had been hiding in her dorm room for 3 days when the noise came from the ceiling. For more than 72 hours, she had ignored all the pleas from Jenny and Nate, and even one of the school guidance counselors asking her to open up the door and talk to them. Even one of her professors had come with Jenny to implore Jasmine to come out of her room and begin attending class. Still, Jasmine refused. For the first 2 days, she hadn't even responded until the counselor had threatened to have the campus police come and unlock the door to ensure that she was unharmed and not overdosing or drinking on campus or doing something else hazardous to her or someone else's health. She knew she had them worried, but she would rather they suspect something like that than know the truth. "Jazz," Jenny had beseeched her, almost in tears, "you don't have to do this alone. Whatever it is, we'll help you. We'll be here for you, I promise." That had been Jasmine's lowest point, the time she had almost given in and accepted the offer. She wanted to tell them so badly, but she wanted even more badly to keep her secret safe, for her own good and for the good of everyone she knew. That hadn't stopped the knocking, the scratching, the people waiting on the other side of the dorm door. She had cleaned up her room as much as she could. There were still bits of ceramic on the kitchen floor. She had lost one of her notebooks, which had been empty anyway since she had only gone to class for 1 day. The fridge was still a little out of place, and there was a small crack in the frame of her family picture. But without knowing exactly what had happened, it would be a random guessing game for whoever else entered. That was what Jasmine didn't want, all the questions that she could never answer, lying to Jenny and Nate, looking them in the eye and trying to tell them something that was flat out not true, and then running the risk that someone wouldn't believe her. It was a legitimate risk, too, because she was terrible at telling a bald-faced lie when she was nervous. Lies of omission were no big deal for her. Her entire life had been one of those. But the other kind of lies were more difficult. It hurt to tell them, and so she was bad at it. No matter how many times she practiced in front of the mirror to herself, telling another human being a lie was different. It was a scenario she had played out in her head many times over the past 3 days. She would try to come up with quick, sensible answers to their queries, the lie wouldn't stick, she would be found out, and on top of all that, she would have hurt the people she cared about and have nowhere else to go and no one to turn to. It was her worst nightmare, and it had been trying to get into her dorm room for 3 days. But this noise from the ceiling was different. It was a thudding, like someone was moving around up there. She thought at one point she heard someone knocking, thought it was the door again, but then realized that it had come from above her bed. She had spent most of her time these past 3 days buried under her blankets in bed, dressed in a t-shirt and sweats, going back and forth from her bed to the bathroom mirror to practice lying about who she was, trying not to sleep for fear it could all happen again. But now she poked her head out from beneath the blue quilt. She was on the 3rd floor, the top floor of the dorm, so there shouldn't be anything above her. She wanted to assume that it was maybe some maintenance project or construction on the roof. Had it been a little cold in here? Maybe the heat wasn't working and that's what they were trying to fix. But it sounded really close, as in right on the other side of the plywood. Someone was working their way through a duct in the ventilation system, so they were working on the heat? But then, why would they be coming through the whole roof when they could just come into her room and do it from there? The answer was obvious. Someone was trying to get to her. They'd given up trying to come in through the door, and they were trying to sneak in through the ceiling. They'd found out her secret and were coming for her. Or maybe it was Jenny and Nate making a last-ditch attempt to get in to see her? She would rather imagine that than the alternative. "Jenny?" she called softly, hearing her voice tremble. "Nate?" The noises stopped. Jasmine slowly, quietly, got off her bed, not taking her eyes off the ceiling. Her room back home had been blessed with a ceiling fan above her bed when she was 9, but her dorm room had no such accoutrements, and she would rather have been staring at moving fan blades than watching and waiting for something terrible to pop out from the plaster and disclose her secret to the rest of the world. "Hello?" she called again, a little louder this time. She silenced herself, not wanting to alert anyone who might have come to the door without her knowing, but she ached to move past the suspense of this moment. Who's there? Another painful pause. She tuned her ears to listen for even the faintest sound. She thought she heard something, but suspected her brain was playing tricks on her, giving her the sound she was looking for without it actually being there. She didn't even know what she was listening for, let alone what she would do when she heard it. She went back and forth in indecision. Should she continue to call out, or give up and get back to bed? Was it safe? Just as she was about to speak again, she heard a noise that was unmistakably real. Another thud just above her bed where she'd been sitting, and an ever-so-muffled vocalization. Ow. For a split second, her body froze, and she gaped at the tiny spot on the ceiling where she expected her destruction to emerge. She could have sworn there was a voice, but she doubted herself. She imagined it cracking open, the secret government agent spilling out in all black, his night vision goggles and the laser from his silenced assassination pistol pointed at her, the creepy breathing she would hear from behind his mask that he wore just in case she was contagious with some sort of telekinetic disease that made her into what she had become. Then her fear clutched her throat as the exact spot in the ceiling where she was staring suddenly cracked along the same lines as her imagination. A moment of silence, the ceiling mostly intact, and then the weight of whatever was on the other side bowed the ceiling inward. "Oh, crap," said the voice as the plaster and drywall, weakened from the crack, buckled and opened up. "Crap!" The person in the ceiling tumbled out headfirst in a cascade of plaster, splintered drywall, and insulation dust, straight down onto Jasmine's bed. Jasmine would have screamed and run into the kitchen for a knife or something, but she was frozen solid with terror. She barely flinched when the man rolled over on her bed and coughed, sputtering out a mouthful of the pink cotton candy padding, holding up his hands as he backed away. No, don't do it," he begged in between coughs. "It's okay, miss, please." Jasmine, still surprised that she was standing and not pinned to the floor in handcuffs or worse, didn't know what to make of his reaction. What, huh?" she asked numbly, finding her voice but still unable to move. The dust began to settle, and the young man, she could see him a little better now, waved his hand in the air, trying to clear the remaining dust and shield his eyes. His thick blonde hair came down almost to the base of his neck, and he ran his hands through it, trying to get the pieces of plaster and wood splinters out. He let out one last big cough and looked at Jasmine warily, making sure to keep the bed between them. He was dressed in a leather jacket, black jeans, and a dark gray t-shirt, which was splotched with pink from the insulation and black from crawling around in the air ducts. He didn't look like the government assassin she'd been expecting. He was young. He appeared to be about her age, actually. "Who are you?" she wondered aloud, surprised that she was speaking. Her mind was still on the potential weapons in the kitchen. She was ready to go for one of them if she had to in order to get away. "I'm Jason," the young man told her, rubbing his eyes from the tiny particles that threatened to invade them. He breathed in deeply and looked around at the mess he'd made. He turned a little red and glanced up at her with brilliant, sparkling green eyes. "Sorry about your bed," he said sheepishly. "What do you want?" Jasmine demanded, feeling only slightly less threatened. Well, actually, this is really awkward. I was trying to spy on you," he admitted with a shrug. Jasmine's heart clogged her throat and her eyes grew wide. Her mind flashed through all the different possibilities, terrified of most of them. "So before you say anything else," Jason said, holding up his hands, "I want you to know that I wasn't waiting for you to get undressed or anything. I mean, you're cute and all. Actually, you're really cute. This isn't working." Jasmine just stared at him, waiting for him to do something. She didn't know how to respond to this. He didn't seem like an immediate threat, but she wasn't going to take her chances. She stepped back very quickly into the kitchen, just out of Jason's view, and she heard him protest immediately, just as she thought he might. "Oh, no, wait, please, miss, I didn't mean—" Jasmine reappeared with her largest kitchen knife, which wasn't as big as she had imagined a few moments earlier, but she hoped the sight of it would deter the intruder. Jason had been moving to come around the bed, probably trying to catch her before she got out, but he froze and stopped speaking when she stepped back into view, holding the straight blade out in front of her with both hands. "Don't come any closer," Jasmine said, feeling bolder now that she felt she had some control over the situation. "Now what do you want?" "Look, I'm not gonna do anything to you," Jason exclaimed, clearly frustrated. "I just want to talk." "About what?" Jasmine asked back accusingly, surprised at the intensity in her own voice. "All right, can you put the knife down and quit being so defensive?" Jasmine was so incredulous she could barely speak. "What? You broke into my room!" "Hey, technically, I wasn't even in your room until you busted the ceiling out from under me," he said defensively, gesturing to the hole in the ceiling that looked pretty bad now that Jasmine thought about it. She paused. What had he just said? "You fell in," she informed him uncertainly. "The ceiling cracked open and you fell in." Jason shook his head. "I'm pretty sure that was you," he said slowly. "I've been in that ceiling at least one other time in the past 3 days, and I stayed there for hours. I moved around and everything, and it held my weight just fine till today." "You've been up there for 3 days?" Jasmine gasped, the fear and rage mingling inside her and forming into a wave of sheer panic. No, that's not what I said." "What do you want?" Jasmine yelled, stepping forward and raising the knife above her head with both hands. "I wanted to see what your power is, all right?" Jason sputtered, one hand held up in between them. "And if you come at me with that knife, I'll have to use mine on you." For a moment, Jasmine's worst fears were confirmed. This man knew about her, whatever it was, he called them powers. He'd been spying on her for days, and now he had discovered her secret. But it was only him. For a fraction of a second, she briefly considered that fact. She was standing here. She had a knife. No one else seemed to be around. He couldn't tell anyone about her if he was dead, could he? But that idea was stupid. Jasmine wasn't a killer, and she'd never get away with it anyway. Her life would be ruined, and she would be a murderer. She might be able to justify self-defense, but it would probably be the worst lie she'd ever told, and she wasn't willing to go that far to protect her secret. Maybe if she threatened him. She wasn't a killer, but he didn't know that. She'd have to be convincing, and she was a terrible liar. "Wait. I'll have to use mine on you." "What did you say?" Jasmine stopped, the knife held in midair as she realized in the heat of the moment what the boy had just said. He had his own secret to keep? As if to bring her out of her panicked funk, the boy stood back and put both hands out, palms facing each other. Jasmine, frozen in place once again, not sure what to do, simply watched as a soft red glow came from the center of Jason's chest. No, not his chest, in between his hands. The glow became red sparks, dancing back and forth, from one end to the other, and finally bright red beams of light that formed a spinning, intertwined spiral, a soft, soothing hum reaching her ears. It looked kind of like a DNA spiral, or a tiny red tornado, except sideways, and it was made of dancing light moving in between Jason's hands. Jasmine's arms dropped to her sides, and she heard the clink as the knife fell to the floor. She had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. She tore her eyes away from the incredible display and looked up at Jason's face. He was staring at his own work, wide-eyed, focused with laser-like intensity on what he was doing. His skin and blonde hair were red from the glow of the light, but somehow his green eyes still sparkled dazzlingly, as if the red light from his hands made his eyes even greener. His hands shook as the spiral rotated faster and faster, the hum becoming a whirring noise like a jet engine warming up. His fingers were extended all the way, and his arms and shoulders started to shake. And finally he closed his hands together with significant effort, finally allowing himself to take a breath as the red light vanished without a trace. "Whew," he gasped, a stupid, goofy grin spreading across his face. "Man, sometimes I impress even myself." Jasmine stepped to her left in shock and felt her way to a sitting position on the edge of her bed. She was speechless. Her world had been turned upside down in those few moments when Jason had revealed himself to her, and she didn't know how to process what she'd just seen. Jason watched her for a minute, fidgeting with his jacket, wringing his hands, and then when he saw that she was just going to sit there staring at him with her mouth open, he decided to move the conversation along. I know this is probably really surprising for you. Actually, I'm sure it is. Not probably, that's the wrong word because you're sitting there with your mouth open, which means you're surprised. He stopped and slapped his face. "Let me start over," he said, as if she was in a position to deny him permission to continue speaking. "I knew you lived here because I come from a house where there are lots of us with different powers. Well, not lots, more like 4 right now, but the point is that we're looking for more people like us." Jasmine tried to focus her thoughts on what he was saying, but she couldn't get the red glow, the swirling lights, and Jason's green eyes out of her mind. "If your life has been anything like mine, you've been hiding your secret from people about as long as I have," Jason continued. Her ears picked up the words hiding and secret as if she was an antenna picking up radio signals. He had her full attention. "But it doesn't have to be like that," he told her, becoming more enthusiastic as he spoke, his hands beginning to gesture in strange ways. "We have these powers, and they're awesome, and we should be able to use them to do things. We have them for a reason, and maybe our reasons are different, maybe they're not, I don't really know, but we should have a way to find out, and we shouldn't have to hide them from other people." It still was taking her a little longer than normal to process this information, but the things that Jason was saying resonated with her. She had thought these same things once, but she'd been so discouraged before today that she'd never allowed herself to believe it was possible for fear of the massive disappointment that it might bring with it. "So, I guess what I'm saying," Jason stammered, struggling through to his conclusion, "is that if you're like me, and you've been struggling with this too, there's a place for you, where you can belong." Jasmine's eyes began to fill with tears, and she felt so sure that this was a dream. No, a nightmare. It was too painful to imagine that this could happen, and then she would wake up and find that none of it was real. If that was the case, she didn't want to stay here and indulge this fantasy any longer. She pinched herself with a groan, then looked around, expecting the world to fade away, or at least bring her back to reality. Nothing changed. "Nope. This is real," Jason said softly, stepping forward. "It's real. This place is real. There's a place where you can go, where you don't have to hide your secret anymore, because no one has to hide their secrets anymore. We want to help you. And we think that we can all be one big family, and that our big family of super awesome people will one day be able to change the world." Jasmine trembled, her tears sliding down her cheeks even though she tried very hard to stop them. I... She could barely get the words out. "I want to be alone." Jason nodded understandingly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny card. He handed it to her, and Jasmine took it. Even with her tear-blurred vision, she could tell that it was an address, and the street was one that she recognized from driving around town in the few days before she'd moved into her dorm, when she'd done some driving to get to know the neighborhood. "If this sounds like it's too good to be true," Jason started, then trailed off searching for the right words. "Well, if it does, then... Actually, I have no idea what to tell you if you think that. Bottom line is, this is where we live, and you can drop in any time and meet the rest of us super awesomes." He knelt down so that he was eye level with her. He seemed like he was about to reach out and touch her shoulder, but he decided against it for his own reasons, apparently. "I'm serious, miss. Any time at all, miss. She found her voice at last. "Jasmine," she croaked, embarrassed at how feeble she sounded. "Jasmine," he repeated with a smile and a wink. "I like that name. It's almost as pretty as you are." Jasmine closed her eyes, unable to meet the emeralds in front of her out of awkwardness, and when she opened them, he was gone. The door of her dorm was cracked slightly, and she stared at it for a moment before getting up. Had Jason been real? She walked forward and opened the door, peering out into the hallway. Nothing. She closed and locked it, unable to decide whether she'd been dreaming or not, whether she'd just imagined something that she had wanted so badly for so long. It couldn't be real. Then she remembered her sense of touch and rediscovered the card in her hands. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and looked at the card. The address was there, all right. Her vision swam with images of the red lights and Jason's green eyes, and she was brought almost to the edge of belief when she looked up and saw the plaster and drywall mess on her bed, and also the hole in her ceiling. In spite of herself, Jasmine laughed a little, a half-laugh, half-cry expression of her tumultuous emotions of the moment. So he doesn't have the superpower of staying and helping clean up his mess, she thought. I guess he doesn't want to change the world that much. But she didn't mind. Cleaning up the mess helped her cement the realism of what had just occurred in her mind, and it also helped her think about what excuse she could possibly come up with that might explain why there was a random hole in her dorm room ceiling when she called maintenance later that evening.